Good afternoon, everyone, or perhaps good morning or good evening, depending on where in the world you are today. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have everyone here. My name is John Banghart. I'm a senior director with the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. I know many of you on today will be familiar with the center, but for those of you that aren't, the center is a not-for-profit organization that really focuses on initiatives and research and influence around where cybersecurity policy, law, and technology sort of come together. And we look for sort of big issues that we can make real change in, right, as a part of a community, as part of a group. You may be familiar with some of our existing initiatives, such as the Cybersecurity Coalition or the Better Identity Coalition. And today we're going to talk about vulnerability management. And we're talking about it in the context of a new initiative that the center is standing up, a new coalition of companies, of organizations from across all sectors to really look at some key areas and key issues inside of vulnerability management. That's a big topic, right? We know it's a big topic. We're going to touch on some of those pieces today, but this is really just the start of the conversation from our perspective. And so there will be an opportunity at the end. I'll bring up a slide that has some contact information on it. Highly encourage you to take a look at that. Reach out to us if you're interested. I'll come back to that as well as we get through the great topics we have today. And we do have some just amazing speakers from both the public and the private sector. No doubt you had an opportunity to look at the agenda. The good news is everyone's here, so we're very excited about that. And with that, it'll be my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, Jeff Green. So Jeff Green is currently the Chief of Cyber Response and Policy in the NSC's, that's the National Security Council's Cyber Directorate. Jeff previously served as the Director of the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is where industry, government, and academic institutions work together to identify pressing cybersecurity issues and to develop practical cybersecurity solutions to address them. Prior to NIST, Jeff was Vice President of Global Government Affairs and Policy at Symantec. He served as an appointed member of NIST's Information Security and Privacy Advisory Board for about 5 years and was a special government employee at NIST, supporting the President's 2016 Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. Prior to all of that, as if that wasn't enough, he worked on both the House and Senate Homeland Security Committees. So Jeff, thank you so much for being here. We know you're super busy. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, John. Thumbs up. Can you hear me all right, John? Just making sure.
Yeah, you sound great. Thank you.
Great. Apologies, folks, that I cannot be on video, unfortunately. It's tough to find a room right now where I could set up with video, so I'm going to go with just the audio. As John said, though, this is it's a big issue. When John mentioned that they were looking into vulnerability management, my first reaction was, well, what part? So it's good to hear you're going to take on different pieces of it. Hopefully by now you all can see that cybersecurity is very much a priority for President Biden, for this administration. We've dedicated a significant amount of time and resources to it. The public results that you all have seen are the Cybersecurity EO from April, the Industrial Control System initiatives. There have been 2 out so far, electric sector and natural gas pipelines, National Security Memorandum, and then most recently the summit that the President held in late August. And that doesn't even go into some of the incident response work that we've had to do between SolarWinds when we came in, or Hafnium, or some of the large ransomware issues that have happened. Stating the obvious, which I think is the reason John's putting this together, vulnerability management is a persistent issue, whether we're talking about software, hardware, embedded software. It's frustrating, no doubt, to all of us that this is still a problem today. It's not because we all don't know that it needs to be addressed, and it's not because people haven't tried and tried again. It's because the solutions aren't easy, and it's not necessarily because they're complex technically. Sometimes it is, but other times it's a matter of getting all the ducks in a row to make significant change. And that's where an initiative, an effort where you bring a bunch of companies together like we're talking about today, I think is a real opportunity to drive some change. The sad reality is that most attackers are taking advantage of long known and patchable issues, patchable being very different from patched. And it's going to be like this until we get better both at patching and at preventing vulnerabilities to begin with. It would be a really great day if we can get to the point that attackers would have to hunt for 0 days and build really complex attacks. But that's obviously not today. And until we build better and secure better, we're going to keep seeing preventable attacks, but hopefully efforts like you all are kicking off can narrow that. I want to hit on a couple of things that the administration has put out. I mentioned earlier, but how I think they touch on the work you're doing. First, the executive order, the I think 14028 signed in end of April, is very much focused on the U.S. government, but it has some pieces that are relevant to today, and I think that are going to have broader application. In particular, Section 4 focuses on the software supply chain and secure development practices, directs NIST to develop guidelines for enhancing software supply chain security, and generally meeting the requirements of the section, which are that secure development. So NIST has done a fair amount of public work on that already, and we're looking forward to seeing their output in the next few months. But the thought behind this was pretty basic: is we can no longer live with this mindset of, build, sell, and then maybe patch later on. We have to look at security from the beginning. We have no conceit that we are somehow the first people to recognize this as a problem, but the administration did have the ability to put some oomph behind it. In this case, the force of the power of the federal purse. And the short version is, pretty soon, if organizations don't follow secure development practices, they're just not going to be able to sell to the government. So our hope is that will drive more secure products to the government, and also in turn more secure products to all Americans. The National Security Memorandum that the President signed on critical infrastructure cybersecurity a few months ago comes at it from a little bit of a different angle. It takes the approach, how do we secure the systems that we're currently running, in particular critical infrastructure? And we tried to hopefully have CISA and NIST look at that in two areas. First, what steps can you take now to secure the systems you have? But also in the future, what should you anticipate? How can you see where the next vulnerabilities, the next issues are going to arise? CISA and NIST are putting out some preliminary performance goals later this month. And then I think there's going to be a good opportunity for comment, public feedback, and then hopefully a series of these going forward. And the final thing I'll touch on is the President's August 25th Cybersecurity Summit. At that summit, President Biden announced that NIST is going to be working with industry and partners to develop a framework more broadly to improve security integrity of the technology supply chain. Of note, we had a discussion internally whether we talk about it as software or hardware or just technology. And given the integration of technology generally, the NIST folks believed, and we agreed, that doing this in a broad approach is the best way to do it. The hope is that this will serve as a guideline for both public and private entities on building secure technology, assessing the security of the technology, and including open source software. We were pretty excited that a number of companies jumped into that initially. I know NIST has continued to do outreach since then. My understanding, I think you can look for some more public announcements soon as to the next steps, but they're very eager and looking for private sector, academia, nonprofit partnership on that effort, and hopefully this group can get engaged. And I would note that we're not reinventing the wheel in the sense that a lot of the input that CISA and NIST got in the supply chain security work is going to be applicable in that effort as well. So we very much are looking forward to working with the center and all of you folks on the line today. We're particularly excited that this group is going to be focusing on vulnerabilities, and I'd close by saying that right now you have a very interested, eager partner in the government at NSC, at NIST, and definitely at CISA. I think we're going to hear from Eric next. So please look forward to engaging with us. Feel free to reach out to us, and appreciate the time and the effort. John, over.
Jeff, thank you so much. And again, we really appreciate that. Obviously, really appreciate everything that the administration is doing in this space and the role that you and your colleagues play in the National Security Council. So thanks for joining us for this today, and hope you can stick around, but understand if you've got to get back to work. So again, thank you very much. So moving forward, one quick change. Eric Goldstein from CISA is going to speak at the end of the program. So he is still on the agenda, but we're going to shift him to the end. So please stick around to hear Eric talk. So instead, what we'll do is we will bring ourselves right to the very first panel. And so just a little bit of background as the panelists come into the video and audio. We've got two sections to our agenda today that we really wanted to focus on. And really the first is going to be around this vulnerability standards landscape, right? And what we want to focus on in this panel is looking at some of the standards that have sort of underlied so much of what has been done in vulnerability management really over decades, whether it's CVE, CVSS, others. So we've got three great panelists for that today, all three of whom happen to be CVE board members. We're very happy to have them. And what I'm going to do is ask each panelist, I'll introduce them briefly. For each panelist, they'll tell you a little bit about who they are, what they do, and their interests in this subject, and in particular in what the center is trying to do as part of this initiative. So first, I'll start with Jess Colvin from JPMC. So Jess, over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and whatever else you have to say.
Thanks so much, John. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm very excited about the next couple of hours talking about my very favorite topic of vulnerability management. My role at JP Morgan Chase is I run the vulnerability management and penetration testing functions for the firm, which essentially means that myself and my team are responsible for detecting, responding, and managing the overall risk of vulnerabilities to the entire organization, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty busy function. And we tend to get engaged on multiple fronts when it comes to vulnerability management. In terms of the reason for being here, twofold. Firstly, my role on the CVE board, which is absolutely a passion project for me, but also my interest in, from a consumer perspective and from a practitioner perspective of, consuming and using the vulnerability management standards that exist today is something which is very close to my heart. And John probably is going to get very bored of me telling this story, but the idea for this coalition kind of came about at an FSISAC conference in Washington pre-COVID. John and I met in the bar in the hotel, and we started having a long discussion about how excited we were about vulnerability management, and in particular about CVE, the CVE board, and kind of future ideas. So this is very exciting for me to be here and be part of this discussion. And my interests are obviously twofold from a JPMC day job, but also from an overall particular interest in vulnerability management.
That's great, Jess. Thank you so much. And I'm going to come back to some of the motivations behind that. So in the meantime, though, let's go and meet our other panelists. So Dave, over to you.
Thanks, John. My name is Dave Waltermeier. I work at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where I serve in a number of different roles. As John mentioned, I've been a longstanding CVE board member. I work with Jess and Kent in that capacity. Within CVE, I co-chair something called the Quality Working Group, which is focused on defining data formats for representing CVE information, as well as general process improvement for how things work within CVE. At NIST, my primary role is to, as it relates to CVEs, to help connect CVE and the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, to the end user community, and to bring that end user community perspective to the CVE project. I also help to represent lessons learned from running the National Vulnerability Database as it relates to the CVE effort. To make sure that we're able to capture some of those experiences and use them to the community's advantage. A lot of my interests around CVE focus a lot on modernizing the CVE efforts, trying to bring more federation into CVE. If you look back 4 or 5 years ago, CVE was a very centralized effort run by the MITRE Corporation. Today, CVE is a very federated effort that has a lot of different stakeholders who are participating in CVE, all working together to produce the information that the CVE program today produces. And that's been because of the work of of many people involved in the CVE community to try to bring that federated approach that CVE is adopting today. And so I've been a part of delivering on that. I also have some interest in standardizing the way we identify hardware and software assets, which is very critical to vulnerability management. We need to be able to identify the things that we're managing vulnerabilities against, and that's been an ongoing challenge. I've done some work in various SBOM and asset identification efforts to try to bear down on some of those problems. And as I mentioned at the start, I chair a working group that's trying to standardize formats for representing detailed, actionable vulnerability information. And so those are some of my interests. Back to you, John.
That's great, Dave. Thank you so much. And last but certainly never least, Kent.
Thanks, John, and thanks to the Center for inviting me to participate today. My name is Kent Lanfield. I'm Chief Standards and Technology Policy Strategy at McAfee Enterprise. I've worked in multiple roles while here, from Chief Vulnerability Architect to running the McAfee Vulnerability Labs group, in addition to my current role. And as mentioned, I am on the CV board. I'm one of the founding members of CV, so I've been involved for 22 years now. Ouch. Anyway, I'm also chair of the CV Strategic Planning Working Group. One of the reasons that I got involved with CVE initially was that I was working for an intrusion detection vendor at the time, and we were causing people a lot of grief, not having the ability to identify a specific vulnerability as the same vulnerability. So when 2 or 3 different products went off, triggering on the same vulnerability looked like 3, and that was a problem for the incident response teams. So we tried to solve that, and the outcome of that really became CVE. Today, there are lots of cybersecurity standards being produced in many different areas: research and discovery, vulnerability identification, reporting, product integration, threat exchange and correlation, operational uses, just to name a few. These activities come in many different organizations, both national and international organizations, as well as public, private, and commercial organizations. And one of my, I want to sort of set the stage here. One of my issues with the word standards is it's used to encompass a wide range of activities. You can have international standards such as those produced by official standards development organizations, ISO, IEC, IEEE, IETF, and others. They can be national standards, as we all work with the NIST standards on a regular basis, or NIST in the EU. They can be consensus standards based on agreement with a set of organizations or individuals, such as FIRST, or they can be community efforts that set their own standards for use in trying to achieve their goals, such as the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures CV program. One of the problems with standards is, as the saying goes, standards are great, there's so many to choose from. And at times that causes a great deal of problems. For example, in the late 90s, Tony Sager, formerly of NSA and now with the Center for Internet Security, said that we really needed to converge on formats. As an industry, we're spending millions and millions of dollars interpreting data in different formats and converting them into our quote unquote format. So that's a problem that we definitely have. This is very apparent in this vulnerability space. Every effort seems to have its own format for content representation and delivery. We've really not learned much in 20 years when it comes to formats, and we keep trying to do the same thing over and over. Efforts such as the NIST Vontology, Vulnerability Description Ontology, has been trying to create a framework for characterizing vulnerabilities, and David's been very involved in that for quite a while. And some of the emerging efforts that we're seeing in the community around vulnerability management are at least taking the time to reduce the conflict by looking at each other's included content, so there is at least content consistency. Maybe the formats aren't the same, but the content included is. Scoring is another area where standards help prioritize remediations and mitigations, but also complicate things. As the operations folks on this call, I'm sure, are aware, common vulnerability scoring system has been a mainstay for which many vulnerability management shops have used. But the real key here is, what's the real difference between a 6.9 and 7.0, other than it triggers your staff to do a great deal of processes differently? There are new scoring efforts going on right now, and it's one of the things about the cybersecurity community. When people see a need, they try to fill it. And such efforts, such as the stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization effort coming out of Carnegie Mellon, which is SSVC. Surprise, surprise, it's CVSS backwards. And EPSS, the exploit prediction scoring system, which really looks at the potential for exploits on a specific CVE within a 12-month period. And these are expanding the tool set for vulnerability management staff. And I fully expect that we'll see a lot more about these in the not too distant future. And as has been mentioned already, thank you, Jessica, it's definitely one of those things that I truly agree with. It is very encouraging to see the level of passion that many in the cybersecurity standards space have to make real positive progress. And that's one of those positive lights that make it easier to go to work every day. John?
Yeah, no, that's great, Kent. Thank you. And thanks all of you for that. And I think one of the things as we listen to your stories and sort of your backgrounds and your interests here is it revalidates the fact that this is both a very broad topic as well as a very deep topic, right? And it's a long-standing one, right? Many of us here have enough gray hair to show that we've been doing this for decades. And then the problem remains largely the same. But what I liked about some of what I was hearing here is this idea of sort of a passion for it, but also getting voices into the mix that maybe aren't sort of the traditional standards voices, right? Anybody who's worked in standards knows that you often have a usual cast of characters, very smart people who kind of get together on a regular basis and sort of move things along. And I think part of what we've seen is, given the ubiquity of vulnerability challenges for organizations, getting new voices into the mix, and particularly, I think, operational practitioner voices, to my mind, seems absolutely essential. So, Jess, let me come back to you, since you sort of fit that mold, right? So you're somebody that has been a practitioner, an operational person, a leader in that space now for quite some time. And yet you've made the decision, as you say, a passion project, to start getting involved in some of these other pieces. I think what would be interesting to hear, and then maybe follow up from Kent and Dave, is more about what motivated you to do that, more of, not just for you personally, but more of where you see the value in other practitioners, other organizations finding ways to engage.
Yeah, thank you, John. For me, one thing that really struck me when I started in the vulnerability management space several years ago now was just the sheer amount of data. Every day, the teams were consuming vulnerabilities, drinking from the fire hose with the number of vulnerabilities that were being published across industry, which is obviously absolutely the right thing to do for vendors to disclose their vulnerabilities. But the struggles that we had were, well, how do we know which vulnerability is the one that we should be focusing on today? What data points do we need in order to know which fire we need to put out? What other data do we need? What data do we have? What data do we not have? And this is where the standards really underpin, CVSS scoring. Yes, it may not be perfect, but it really does help in terms of having that ability to filter through why we should care about certain vulnerabilities, and then enriching that with other expertise and other intelligence, such as exploitation, is something that we at JPMC, because of our size and our scale, we're able to do because we have access to that data. We have the budget to have access to that data. And I think for me, when I think about my personal interests of being part of the CVE board, probably 2 or 3 different reasons. The first one was, having worked at an organization the size and scale of JPMC, it really gives me a unique perspective of the challenges that you face at scale when dealing with a complex technology environment that has multiple vulnerabilities within it, and trying to kind of navigate those waters from a vulnerability perspective. And that, again, was very interesting. The second one was, okay, if we're having challenges with this, then there must be other organizations that don't have the same size and scale of JPMC or the same budget as JPMC who are absolutely having challenges with this. And how can I help, using my unique position, to kind of give that perspective of the operations people? The operational role is not the most exciting role at times, although I personally think it's very exciting. But we really get, again, that unique perspective of, my goodness, there's a lot here. What do we do first? And what data points do I need in order to know this is a vulnerability? Yes, I care about it. And then put hands on keyboard to go ahead and either patch it, remove the vulnerability from the environment. And so that's really where my passion came from, is first and foremost, having that unique perspective, but then in order to kind of give back to the overall security community of giving that lens and providing that voice on the board.
That's great. That makes a ton of sense. Kent and Dave, anything you want to add to that from your perspective in terms of this getting other voices into the mix?
Well, that was one of the reasons that we were very excited to have Jess join the board. We were very, very vendors focused or government body focused, and we really needed to get that end user voice, having the ability to have that insight on the day-to-day problems of how they use, in this case, CVE, how it can evolve into something that's beneficial to them. This is why we do CVE in the first place. It's not because we want to identify vulnerabilities and that's it. It's a downstream positive effect to benefit the entire community. So if we have the more voices that we have participating from the standpoint of really being able to bring their perspectives and their uses of CVE, that just encourages us to do better as a program.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with everything that Kent and Jess have said, but I would also add that I think it's really important for us to hear from end user constituencies that are representative of the diversity of end user organizations that we have out there. We have academics that are doing research in the vulnerability space. We have large and small businesses that are that have unique challenges between them. And part of what we need in order to make sure that CVE is delivering on the promise of providing vulnerability information is really a deeper understanding of the challenges that these different types of organizations face. And so I think it was a great step having Jess participate in the CVE board, but we definitely need more organizations to participate in the same way that Jess is to really make sure that we're hitting the mark and delivering for the CVE community.
So that's actually, Dave, a great segue into something that I wanted to raise, starting with you, which is, NIST obviously sits in the middle of a lot of this, right? Obviously, there's a lot of standards work that happens outside of NIST, although NIST is a contributor and a participant in that. How do we get more folks engaged in a way that makes sense, right? So, for example, not everybody can be a CVE board member, right? We'd have a board of 1,000 people, which of course we know we'd never get anything done. So what are some of the other ways from a NIST perspective that companies can contribute that maybe they're not thinking about? Or what are some of the gaps that you see where some help could be useful?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I mean, I think in part of my role at NIST is to collect feedback, from some of these these end user groups, because they're users of the NBD, or because I'm participating with them in various standards organizations or efforts. But secondhand information is fine, but there's no substitute from hearing directly from the people who are to these challenges. We're working pretty actively, I think, in CVE to try to do more outreach to the community, and part of that is part of our general federation strategy, where we're trying to work to reduce as much inertia in the process. So we've been working on standing up a variety of different provide information about vulnerabilities instead of working through a third party to publish that data. Some of the advances that we're soon to release in the next few months will allow organizations to publish that data directly. We're working on trying to collect more information about the operational challenges that organizations are having. Like Kent mentioned, we spent a lot of time talking to what we call CNAs or CV numbering authorities to understand where their challenges are in providing CV information. we've done a lot to reach out to these parties. We've formed a number of different working groups. We have something called the CNA Coordination Working Group in CVE, which is intended to provide a mechanism to network with that community and to give them a larger voice. We have a liaison from that working group to the CV board, Todd Beardsley, who is bringing that perspective to the CV board. We are also working on trying to increase the transparency of the various efforts within the CVE program. We've recently started a CVE podcast called We Speak CVE, and I think Kent and I have both done a number of podcasts updating the community about some of the various efforts that CVE has been working on. That's part of an effort driven by the Outreach and Communications Working Group that's part of CVE. So those are all efforts to try to educate the end user. But I think where CVE is still lacking really is in connecting with that end user community. And we've been talking more and more recently about hosting more workshops and conferences and things like that would help us connect better with the end user community and hear directly from them. And I think that's something that we need to focus more on going forward.
That's great, thank you. And Kent, before I come to you, I had a question prepared, but I think somebody actually put a question into the chat that I think is maybe worth touching on at this point. And apologize to this individual if I do not get their name correctly, but Sivaram Rajagopalan asks, what would your summary to CISOs be regarding CVE, CWE, CVSS, and other standards, vulnerability management standards, that could help the cause? That is, what's the elevator pitch to kind of go to operational leaders and say, this is why these things matter to you? I think we heard a little bit of that from Jess and her perspective, but are there other things that we can add to this? And Ken, I'll give you the floor first if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great. First off, let me answer the question you had right before, because I think it's important. One of the reasons that Jess reached out and started to become a part of the CVE community is because she felt that was important to her company and to her. It was a passion project, as I think she mentioned. There's nothing that's inhibiting any company from being able to do that themselves. The standards are, for the most part, not closed. They're very open development efforts. There is cost when it comes to, travel or some of those things in the pre-pandemic years. Now everything is sort of Zoom. But, so it's a lot easier for companies today to actually find their little niche of where they feel they need to be a part of helping to drive the directions for vulnerability management. And I would encourage any and all to take that up and look at where it makes the most sense for them and for their company as a whole, and then go participate. It's not rocket science. It's just a matter of showing up, having a concern, having a passion to do the right thing for the industry and community and your company. So those things are something that I think everybody can participate in today. So from a standpoint of an elevator pitch, I'm not really good with elevator pitches, but the key here is that all of these efforts are here to enhance automation. Automation is going to drive reduced costs to the organization. It's going to drive more effective ability to handle those times when vulnerabilities become an attack vector. It will allow the organization to be able to work more efficiently. Without those types of standards, CVE, CWE, and the like, it's harder for organizations to help prioritize, like Jessica said. Prioritization is important when it comes to workload and resources. So these work for helping the organization's operations and to make it efficient and as cost effective for the human resources as possible.
And to John, I'm going to add to that, and I'm taking advantage of you being on mute. For me, the way that I have described this to our CISO is, and touching on what Ken mentioned, it's really an efficiency play. We're talking, using these standards, we're talking one language, and I can talk one language with strategic partners, with vendors, with our intelligence community, within my own team, and more importantly, from a financial services perspective, with our internal and external supervisory. They all understand CVE, they all understand CVSS, and we can have an intelligent conversation with any and all organizations around the standards we use, why we use them, where we set our risk thresholds. It becomes very difficult if you're using an internally developed measure or standard that is not understood on the street. And that's really why this is so important, because it allows us to be and to traverse across multiple different facets within the security and technology industries. And it's really that simple. Is it, CVE, you read it on, dark reading or bleeping computer, CVE language is there when we talk about vulnerabilities, and everyone understands what that means, and everyone understands what a scoring means. And that's so important. It's important for all of us.
Yeah, I think one of the other ways.
Hey, Dave, we lost your audio. Hold on, try again. Now we lost, there you go. We can
Sorry,
see.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, so Jess, one of the ways that I think we're, as you're aware of, we're working to stand up a bunch of infrastructure capabilities that allow third-party organizations as well as software and hardware suppliers to interact, directly with the CVE list. And I think one of the problems that we have in the format space that's driving a lot of the disparate formats is there's a lot of disparate methods for publishing vulnerability information today. That information is scattered over a variety of different open source feeds. And some of the efforts that we're working on in the SPWG and the quality working group is really about using CVE's place in the community as being sort of a central repository of vulnerability information that can be used as a central point for disseminating this information out to the community. And my hope is that by driving all that information into the CVE list, we can start to consolidate formats and focus more on the usability of that information going forward. And I think that's a unique innovation, I think, that has been happening over the last couple of years with CVE that we're getting very close to realizing.
That's great. So one quick note to the participants. Thank you again so much for the questions. They're coming in. Some of them, unfortunately, are sort of out of scope for today, but they are hugely important questions, right? About the role of lawyers, about the role of disclosure. And those are huge topics in and of their own. And while those are things that our initiative ultimately wants to tackle, we're probably going to steer clear of those today. So apologies for that. Important questions, great questions, but they're worth a week's worth of webinars on their own. So we're going to pass on those today. Ken, I'm going to take a chance, go off script just a little bit and come back to something that you said. You feel free to rebuke me if you need to, but you mentioned a couple of other standards that are being developed, like other scoring standards on top of CVSS that maybe are new to people. Can you share your view on what should we as a community, as end users, as operational folks, how should we be thinking about other types of standards that may seem to be competitive to ones we already have in place? Is this a good thing? Should we be encouraging? Do we learn from each other? Is that something that you can talk about?
Oh, gladly. Well, from the standpoint of all of these have a place. The question is how much of it is overlap, and in many cases they aren't overlapping. The SSVC is more focused on decision traits and something that could be very well integrated into a prioritization aspect. The potential for the exploit prediction scoring system coming in and being more useful to the community, which it's basically an AI capability to try to determine exploitability of a specific CVE. This is something that brings, as to Jessica's point earlier, brings more enriched data to the decision-making process. And that's really what needs to occur here. You can't, I'm sorry, I'm not a fan of CVSS because it's one decision point. That one decision point can cause grief. It can help you out. It's what we've had, and that's great. But if you combine some of these scoring mechanisms together, you can bring yourself to a point where you have a much better prioritization framework from which to decide, does this impact my organization, my facilities, and my mission? And that's really, they are emerging, and that's great. But in the cybersecurity space, so is the threats. So we have to evolve with those threats, and providing additional scoring information from different directions that can be leveraged to give you what you really need as a vulnerability management professional is a plus.
That's great. And Jess, I saw you nodding along with that. Is that generally your feeling, being from that operational perspective? Anything that you would want to add?
Yeah, it is. And as Kent was talking, I was nodding vigorously in that, there's two words that spring to mind. The first one is context. CVSS is great as a line in the sand, but there is always specific context to your organization. Multiple vulnerabilities that get published on a daily basis have zero impact at JPMC, either because we don't run the technology, or we don't run that particular configuration, or we have network protections, whereas other organizations don't have that same context. And so the vulnerability will be much more critical to them versus us. And that's where CVSS can prove challenging. The other one is time. A vulnerability can be exploited at any point. If it happens to be exploited post the point it is assessed with a CVSS score and then deemed not material, that changes very, very quickly. And that's something that, organizations have to then enrich their data with that intelligence data and exploitation data on the back of the CVSS score. And I think for me, that's one of the biggest areas of opportunity that we have, is that exploitation likelihood and data around the exploitation of CVEs. And going back to my earlier point around prioritization, we have to be able to prioritize from an operational basis what vulnerabilities are important to our organizations, and that's context and that's time.
That's great. Dave, anything you want to add to there, or ready to move on?
I would just add that I think what we have today are a number of P-certs that are, resourced to be able to provide, some of the information that Kent and Jess are talking about. But we have a big problem when it comes to open source software, and how we gather the necessary contextual information there to do something similar. How we broaden the scope of what CVE is doing across the open source space, and that's an area that we're actively engaging. The CV board and working groups are actively engaging the open source community to see where we can, reduce inertia, increase participation from open source efforts. They're often, under-resourced efforts that that don't have the infrastructure that a lot of P-certs have today. And so we're looking at, what are ways that we could provide some of the basic, capabilities that these organizations would need to, to participate in the CVE program. I think that's an important piece to also address some of the broader concerns that Jess is talking about, because large organizations are broad consumers of open source software, and so that's an area where we actively need input from the community, and plan to continue to do a lot of outreach with the vulnerability management community to collect those ideas.
That's great. And on the point of feedback, for everyone in attendance, Dave had put the email address on how to reach out to the NVD. If you've got thoughts and ideas on that, I think NIST absolutely would welcome those for certain. So thank you for that, Dave.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. So let's turn our attention. We got about 10 minutes, and I'd like to start thinking about a little bit, where do we go next? And we've touched on some of those things here. But Kent, let me come back to you. And you've obviously, as you mentioned, been with CVE from the beginning. Tell us a little bit about sort of where you've seen it come to date, but then also maybe where do you want it to evolve moving forward, and what are some of the things we should all be thinking about when it comes to CVE?
Well, that's a really loaded question.
You have 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes.
Yeah. From the standpoint of CVE, we have a long history. Initially, when it was founded, the members of the board, we called it the editorial board at the time. We actually took a vulnerability report, and everybody on the board had to go test it and then come back and vote on it. And we had candidate CVEs, which needless to say, there's been an evolving growth of the program from the very beginning to where we are today. we started out with a format that only supported 10,000 CVEs in a year. We found that we were exceeding that and couldn't quite get it changed as fast as we would have liked. It took us over two and a half years almost to get the format from we're going to do this to getting it incorporated because of the downstream focuses that we had with all the products and the like. The program itself has had serious problems. There's no doubt about it that we've had to sort of take control, so to speak, in a lot of respects as a community. CVE in 2016 was very different than CVE in 2021. Today we have the change in model completely as to how it works. The board makes the decisions. It's a community consensus on directions is beneficial for everyone. The federated services that Dave has mentioned are being put in place. And to give Dave a little credit, he's the product owner from SPWG for these services. So any case, we're getting to a point where we can scale. And my goal is that with the explosion of technology that's occurring today, that we're not just IT focused. Well, today we're not, but we have been. We've been very IT focused. Traditional IT doesn't exist today. It's a meld of a whole bunch of different types of aspects. And so we have to be able to evolve to address those. We already are seeing vulnerabilities in automotive. We're seeing vulnerabilities in medical areas. CVE is going to succeed if it can become as valuable to those communities as it is to the IT community. So my focus is really to see CVE properly adopted and expand the program so that it can scale to allow for others to come in and take control of certain areas of reporting, identification and reporting from a CVE perspective. Today, it shouldn't be centralized. It should be very, very decentralized. And so we're working towards that.
That's great. Thanks, Ken. And as you said, loaded question, but I appreciate you giving us some of that insight. That's great. So Dave, over to you. Sort of last word. You've touched on a number of things that NIST is doing, that you're doing. Sort of what's the last thing that you would like to leave folks with today in terms of what you see coming next or what you think is important? You're on mute, Dave.
Mute.
Hey, Dave, you're on mute. There you go.
Today to participate in this conversation. I think this is an example of what we need to do more of. We need to go to the places where members of the vulnerability management community are, and tell them about the good work that CVE is doing. Tell them about ways that they can interact with CVE and collect their feedback. So I think staying connected to the community is a very important piece moving forward. It's necessary for us to ensure that we're delivering the targeted solutions that our community members need, and that we're, as Kent mentioned, that we're continuing to innovate in the ways that positively impact the vulnerability manager on the ground, as well as the software supplier that's using other software. We need to focus much more on open source and automation, as I've talked about. There's lots that we can do, I think, to reduce inertia and increase participation in those spaces. We need to make identifying a particular vulnerable version of software easier, and to make identification of software easier. We need help to do that from the suppliers of software, and at NIST we're actively working to engage with those communities through our SBOM efforts. So I think these are a few of the ways that we plan to work going forward to better engage with the community and to work to solve the next generation of problems that this space is facing.
Excellent, thank you. And then Jess, over to you. Final thoughts.
Yeah, I think Ken touched on some of this in the sense of we're facing modern technology environments, coming at us at a rate of knots, more so than perhaps we've ever seen before. And for me, it's about making sure that we are able to support the disclosure, remediation of vulnerabilities within those new platforms, and that's twofold. I've touched on it a couple of times today around the prioritization and enrichment of where action needs to be taken, but also is working with strategic partners, vendors, suppliers around secure platforms and secure development. I think there's no better time to be having this conversation in light of the SBOM, which is coming through the President Biden administration. We have real momentum and we have real passion for the topic. And I think making the CVE program scalable, enterprise-wide, beyond just technology and just finance, is something that we really have a great shot at doing. And I'm personally very excited to continue to be involved in it.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all of you being here today. You've given us certainly plenty of insight into the current state of the world. We've brought up a number of topics. I heard SBOM mentioned a number of times. I think that's certainly going to be a topic for future discussion as well. So thank you for that. And again, thanks to all of the audience members, the great questions. I know we couldn't get to many of them, but really appreciate them. And we look forward to continuing some of those conversations as this initiative at the center continues. And so moving forward, let's go on to our second panel. So we've just spent, the last 45 minutes, 50 minutes talking about the standard space, some of the work that's going on there. We've heard a little bit about how that intersects in the operational world. And so we wanted to bring a panel in of some folks who also live in that operational world. And so I'd like to turn it over to my center colleague, Alex Botting, to introduce that panel and to begin that discussion. So Alex, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks so much, John, and to our first panelists for what was a really enlightening opening panel. With me for the second panel of the day, I'm delighted to be joined by Sue Yi, Director of Cybersecurity Operations at Highblock Health, Christopher Byrd, Lead Security Architect at Enterprise Holdings, and Boyden Rona is Associate Director for Vulnerability Management at CISA, the department within the Department of Homeland Security. So welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. What I wanted to do was just give each of you an opportunity to provide a few opening remarks on the topic, maybe 3 or 4 minutes of remarks. And Sue, perhaps we could impose upon you to go first.
Thank you. I'm Sue Yi, and I represent Highmark Health, which is a healthcare provider and payer, meaning it's an insurance organization as well as a clinical operations with a number of hospitals throughout the country. And regarding vulnerability management, we actually call it vulnerability governance in our department, and it's now partnered up with some platform security services that we're pulling together into an organization. Because we do see that as one of the fundamental hygiene aspects of running a platform, whether it's an IT platform or whether it's a software platform. Some of the challenges that we face, especially in the healthcare sector, which I think a few people in our first panel had mentioned, was the fact that if you ever go and walk into a hospital, there are a lot of devices that are not necessarily conventional IT services. So we've got med devices, we've got devices that sort of sit more as appliances, and they may be considered, quote, black box. And there isn't the level of rigor developed regarding managing vulnerabilities, identifying vulnerabilities within those devices or appliances, as there has been in sort of traditional IT environments and products. And that's a challenge for us because now it's just a new environment, a new target that when you have a very target-rich environment that also, by the way, as a business, zero tolerance for downtime, for zero tolerance for being offline or having negative experiences. When you go to a hospital, you as a patient, you're expecting care, a level of care where you're going to be looked after, where everything works. The clinicians are expecting that, the doctors are expecting that. So when we think about vulnerability governance, it now becomes this, this game that has to be played of what do we address from a patching perspective, for instance, for legacy systems that won't impact patient care, but then what do we do from contextualizing vulnerabilities so we can try to mitigate and address those issues that are of the highest severity, because they may present themselves to be with the greater impact to the actual patient. So it is this balancing act. I call it a game because otherwise it would probably make me very sad on a daily basis. But it's something that we have to keep in mind from a healthcare perspective, and it's something that our industry has been debating with other standards organizations outside of NIST. You know, the FDA is a big player within that environment, that market. And there's slowly some eking out of standards and requirements, but probably not at the speed that we expect them to be.
Wonderful. There's some great points in there, which I'm looking forward to digging into a bit further. But before we do that, why don't I turn it over to Boyden to perhaps provide a few opening remarks from CIS's perspective.
Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Boyden Rohner with the newest operational arm of the Department of Homeland Security, which is the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. I work in the Cybersecurity Division and oversee our vulnerability management portfolio. We at CISA, if you aren't familiar, sit at the intersection of the federal government, the intelligence community, state and local governments, the private sector, and we take advantage of that unique vantage point to look across all 16 critical infrastructures, all of the nation's critical functions, and try to make sense of all sorts of problems plaguing computer network defenders and critical infrastructure owners and operators. It's my privilege to look at this problem from the vulnerability management lens. And, so specifically, we sponsor a lot of programs that enable the vulnerability management ecosystem, like the CVE program, which was spoken about heavily on the last panel, always looking to recruit more CVE numbering authorities. We work closely with NIST and a lot of our FFRDC partners to find new ways to make the lives of practitioners like Suyi easier. And so we're always open to feedback. And it's my pleasure to be here to get deeper into this conversation with you all.
Great, thanks, Boyden. We'll turn over to Christopher now for your opening remarks.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Really appreciate it. My name is Christopher Byrd. I'm working as a lead security architect at Enterprise Holdings, and I'm really interested in different ways of looking at vulnerability management, which is why I'm here today. So, what I've been really focused on is looking at vulnerability management from shifting it from a traditional, costly, focus stealing activity to something that is very cost effective for an organization. And so to do that, I think that the primary thing that I'm advocating for is moving from the idea of what is vulnerable to the question of why is this vulnerable. And to do that, really, it is moving to build vulnerability remediation into the business as usual practice rather than something that we tack on at the end of the process, so to speak. So from that standpoint, I'd like to ask people to in your minds frame up vulnerability management for a moment as a quality assurance function, as something that a QA person might look at. And I'm going to give a couple quotes from some people in the industry. Harold Dodge said, you cannot inspect quality into a product. And that quote comes from Edward Deming's book, where he goes on to say the quality, good or bad, is already in the product. And so really we are today waiting until the end of our virtual factory to apply vulnerability management to systems, but the issues are already there. And so I'm advocating we move that earlier. You know, I use the nautical ship analogy, which Boyden appreciates. The idea that we've been bailing water, and the industry measures how quickly we bail the water, you know, as the measure of success, rather than finding out where the water is coming into the boat and stopping it, right? Which is a lot more effective way to go after that. So there's one outside resource that I bring people's attention to. That Google recently had a security blog on a no, prevent, fix framework that I found to be pretty in line with my thinking. Really, it's that you take this and make it into a continuous process in your organization, which utilizes the best of Agile and DevSecOps processes to minimize the footprint of your applications, and then maintain that those applications and keep them up to date as a ongoing regular basis, rather than, again, something that you just inspect at the end. We talked last time a little bit when we got a chance to catch up as a group that you know, this is like a cyber fire triangle in a way. There's three different things that go into a vulnerability. You've heard a lot of, you know, the impact, of course, and you've heard a lot of talk today about the exploitability. And I was really excited to hear some of the earlier speakers talk about context, because to me, that's one of the most important things that's missing. One of the things that the analogy that I use there is about an apartment complex. And if you know, from an exploitability standpoint, we look at it like, the exploitability says you need to lock your windows on your apartment complex. Well, context says maybe you should start with the ground floor windows, right? Rather than the third floor windows, unless parachuters is maybe your threat actor. So anyway, that's I'll kind of leave it there. I'm sure we'll have a lot more discussion about that as we go, but I really do appreciate it, and turn it back to you, Alex.
Brilliant. Thanks, Christopher. And some great points to threads to pull on from those opening remarks. So, Sue, you mentioned a sort of balancing act and the importance of thinking about security as an enabler, and how kind of difficult that is to put into practice because you're fulfilling critical functions. Can you talk a little bit more about what strategies you put in place to do that effectively, to sort of balance those realities?
Sure, this also takes into account the word context, so maybe that's our word of the day for our webinar, both the first and second panel, because that balancing act requires our resources to convey to our business areas, namely areas like our hospital and our insurance businesses. What is the most important? What's the one thing or the group of things that are the most critical things to worry about today? Because you can't worry about everything. There are probably, if we were to count every patch or update multiplied by the number of assets, whether software or hardware, it would be a lot of different numbers. It'd be a very large volume. But if we look at what do we have to focus on today, given what we know about exploitability, what we know about active exploits, what we know about the impact to the actual patient and or to the member, then security actually serves as not just a threat intelligence service, but as a business intelligence service. And that actually gets the attention and the support from the rest of our organization. Because oftentimes, as I'm sure Chris could attest to, and others could attest to, including Jessica, is security may be seen as sort of it's a different unit. It's treated a little bit with arm's length, and it's very much sometimes a compliance item. But if we actually have that discussion with our business units in terms of help, if you just listen, and if we can make sure we speak in terms of business outcomes and how this impact your organization's ability to function and take care of patients, make money, grab new clients, then I am now speaking your language. And the whole issue of how we manage vulnerabilities or how we govern vulnerabilities becomes an operational discussion with the business versus here's an edict to go patch all these things that exist within the environment without any business context. And then that becomes a much more difficult conversation. We do use services like FAIR, factor analysis of information risk, because that gets it down to a dollar figure. And dollar figures, that's a universal language, right? Doesn't matter what line of business, you're going to care about how much something is going to cost. And if I can quantify it to a dollar amount, then I know that I am, again, the business unit now understands I'm speaking their language. I'm not just talking about vulnerabilities and technical jargon that doesn't really resonate.
Yeah, it's the challenge of taking that sort of subjective judgment, context-specific, placing the context around it to provide a context-driven judgment, and then, as you say, translate it back into something tangible that perhaps someone who's less familiar with these processes can appreciate.
I will say that there is a challenge with that whole concept that I just shared, is to do it at scale and at speed. That's our challenge right now. And automation will help. Data analytics helps because it starts to compress a lot of that data, and you can take proximate information and pull it together into, nice shiny reports for executives to review. I like to see those as well. But to do it at scale and at speed is still a really big hurdle, where we're looking for who is doing that at scale and speed. We have resources at Highmark Health for security. We're very fortunate as a healthcare organization where the business has prioritized security as a business decision maker, but that doesn't mean that we have all of the answers. And so having forums like this helps understand who is doing it at speed and scale, because there may be something that we could leverage off and sort of start democratizing it across our industry.
I see Christopher and Boyden nodding along with much of that. Is your experience similar?
Yes, I'd love to jump in here. In the last panel, I heard Kent refer to a tool that we've also sponsors at CISA called the Stakeholder Specific Vulnerability Categorization, which he correctly identified as CVSS spelled backwards. But I'm with Suyi that the word of the day is the context, because that was a framework that we helped sponsor the development of to make it easy for owners and operators to figure out what decisions they need to make, what actions they need to take. In fact, that is actually one of the outcomes is ACT. That's an outcome of that tool. We use it internally to CISA to decide what kinds of how hard we foot stomp or underscore actions for departments and agencies to take, since we have that ability to mandate action for federal departments and agencies. We know that a lot of times the private sector or state and local governments will see what we're telegraphing through our emergency directives or binding operational directives to the federal civilian executive branch, but we use SSVC in our own for our own purposes, even though we're not a traditional stakeholder, so to speak.
I will add that's the first I've heard of SSVC, and I cannot wait to go look at it. I find that as a fascinating tool, so that'll be great. That's the thing, is that it is very. I look at this like cost, and it is very expensive to do prioritization, particularly when you do it manually. In any case that you can automate the prioritization, that's great. But even the best AI has some challenges with really understanding the context around a technical vulnerability. The I think that the one thing that I see is helpful is when you reduce the noise by doing the other things I talked about earlier about reducing the number of vulnerabilities overall by making that part of business as usual and taking advantage of the new agile methodologies, and then using the tools like SSVC, which sounds really cool, to then kind of handle the rest. So that's great.
So Boyden, perhaps we can turn to you. Both yourself and Christopher have talked about the challenges of managing prioritization of vulnerabilities that are currently being exploited versus ones that could be exploited any day now. And can you talk us through a little bit about the triaging process for that and how you prioritize versus those that we know of and we know are being exploited versus those that could be?
Yes, absolutely. There's so many different variables that go into that determination, but probably the most foundational one that any good cybersecurity program would be built on is knowing thyself and making sure that you have an accurate inventory of what you have in your own environments, as well as having a good handle on identity in your environment too. So that really, everything else is predicated on that. You can subscribe to all sorts of threat feeds. You can have experts that help you understand the virulence of certain types of exploits. Those are all important factors. But one way to eliminate a lot of work for yourself is to know that something doesn't apply to you at all, straight off the get-go. But once you have those foundations in place, if I can, make a baseball analogy here, once you, can see the ball and catch the ball, then you can move on to sort of those base hits. And that would be, prioritizing vulnerabilities that have been, commoditized for exploitation. So those that already have, vulnerabilities that are already being exploited in the wild, those get a big bump up in terms of things that we're seeking to get patched or mitigated, right away. There are a lot of vulnerabilities that have the potential to be very nasty, but the potential is different than kinetic energy, and so let's go after the ones that have that kinetic energy first. Again, we take a very expansive view of the term vulnerability at CISA, not just looking at product vulnerabilities. Those are a huge part of our time, but also if you go to CISA.gov, you'll see we have some bad practices that we've listed, sort of universal things, trying to take the flip side of the coin, not just best practices, but we wanted to kind of go after saying, if you're doing these things, you are irresponsible in this day and age, really wanting to nudge those who have a different authorities or different inspirational tools at their disposal besides us to kind of knock those legs out of the stool. Things like running unsupported end-of-life operating systems, running risky ports and risky services over open ports, and having default passwords. So those are things that we also lump into vulnerability management that you always should find time to put a concerted effort to reduce. Should be a high priority for any CEO or CIO or CISO, and we're hoping that they'll hear that and put the resources on it to knock those things down.
Yeah, and I'll just add, because not the original question, but something Boyden just said, I've seen that CISA bad practices. And that's a great resource. Those are a great way. So you asked, I guess, originally about ways to tackle this, and yeah, looking at ways to fundamentally reduce your overall risk to the vulnerabilities through those bad practices is absolutely great.
Great.
When you're thinking about prioritization in terms of who may be exploiting, what I think I heard you point to is this idea that if there's widespread usage, perhaps amongst less sophisticated actors, you might prioritize that versus a very sophisticated attack where the attacker themselves may have a higher level of risk, but because it's not as widespread, the sort of community risk is lower. Is that about on point?
Well, this is a really complicated issue, Alex. I'm glad you raised it though, because it really depends on for us, it really depends about meeting the organization where they are and really figuring out what the organization is about. This last year, so many US businesses and schools were thumped by ransomware, which many of us sort of stick our nose up and say, oh, these are easy things to prevent against. But in actuality, it really makes a big difference to those owners and operators who had that experience, and perhaps they're not cyber rich and they don't have a lot of resources. They don't have a good patch management or inventorying process. And so we don't want to dismiss meeting the organization where they are in terms of their maturity. Yes, nation state actors have the ability to hold our services at risk. They may be able to operate more sophisticatedly, but we don't need a nation state to make life difficult for a school or a state and local government, or some of the other businesses that we've seen plagued by ransomware this year that may or may not be attributed to nation state activity.
Moving on to Christopher, you talked about shifting this into sort of a business as usual practice, which I think is a good way of thinking about it. One of the factors we haven't talked about there, though, is the geographic implications, i.e. if you're an organization that operates in a number of different countries around the world, there are a number of ways that can complicate things, not least the fact that more and more governments are looking at putting in place requirements in this space. Can you think us through or talk us through rather some of the things that companies can do to make this easier and more streamlined?
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, that's really about scale. At the end of the day, global organizations are very large organizations. And I think it was Boyden earlier mentioned about asset management. Asset management becomes absolutely critical within organizations. I think the old quote is, "You can't protect what you don't know about." So having good asset management is a prerequisite to the vulnerability management activities. And then as you said, Alex, moving to the business as usual to help prevent the introduction of those vulnerabilities in organizations. You need to identify hotspots where you're getting a lot of vulnerabilities being introduced. Often that's because they're missing a process. They're missing a process to harden an image or to patch on a regular basis or configure systems properly, right? And so once you've narrowed down on hotspots of areas of the business that have those kind of trouble, then you can consult with them and work with them to improve those practices, which really kind of raises the boat, so to speak. And so I think that that's some of the ways to deal with it in these larger organizations, that you can kind of face that problem of scale.
So, Boyden, anything to add there?
There is something I do want to make sure we cover, or at least mention. I'm representing an organization that has a lot of legacy software as well, like legacy in-house custom-made software that make up several of our platforms. And I think a lot of the folks in our audience are coming from companies who may have that as well. It's not all COTS, it's not all third party. And so when you have something that we might believe, like let's say a patch from an operating system vendor, that is commodity, it shouldn't take massive testing cycles, and it should be implemented pretty quickly. There are going to be organizations where it's going to take several testing cycles and several releases to vet their own internal product against something that others may feel is a commodity patch, for instance, or an easy to implement, or a BAU action. So I do want us to be mindful of that, because that's a level of complexity where if there isn't a strong DevSecOps process, then there are going to be issues, and you're going to see more vulnerabilities, greater risk, and being subject to some of the issues like ransomware, where you might believe that this could have been 100% preventable, and it could have been, but again, we're dealing with scale, we're dealing with size, and the amount of legacy software that an organization is continuing to develop for themselves without the right level of support, that becomes a problem for not just the engineers, the analysts who are doing it from a security perspective, but frankly, that's just the risk the business has to take.
So Sue, I'll say I absolutely agree with that 100%. I just to call back to some of those bad practices that CISA has, if I could be so bold as to suggest an additional one.
We're all ears.
A bad practice is lack of control over administrative access or administrative interfaces. And so for those legacy systems that you're talking about, which, yeah, all companies have things at various stages of development, some of which have been around for many years. The older systems, a lot of times avoiding just the bad practices, when you have a house, a lot of, I don't try to bring my entire house that was built in 1970s up to code, right, to the modern building codes. But instead, I find the critical things within this building, like, does it have carbon monoxide detectors and fire detection? And, there are certain practices that are more applicable than others. And so with those, I think what you're saying is exactly right on. You can't expect the same level out of those, but you can deal with kind of the risk of those applications being compromised.
And I don't think I'm not trying to say that we can't expect that there's that level of adoption and that level of fix. It's a challenge. So if you're part of an organization where you have that, a lot of homegrown product, homegrown platforms, is there a plan? What is the plan to have that conversation with the lines of business to either migrate to a supportable environment, right? That has, maybe it is a COTS solution that you're going to use that still has to get patched, still has to get updated, still has to get integrated with things like operating systems and middleware that will also need patching and vulnerability governance care. But have a plan in place versus assuming that the house is still standing, so it's okay. The roof hasn't blown off, so we're fine. Not necessarily. But let's make sure we do have those transparent discussions, in our organizations as it pertains to vulnerability management, vulnerability governance, because it's not just the software components, right, of your platform, but it's all how they integrate with your larger ecosystem. And if that end-to-end play isn't there and it's not visible, and no one's caring enough to make it visible, then you're just setting yourselves up at this point.
So I want to jump into some of the questions we've gotten from the audience, because I think there's some really good ones in here. Dick Brooks asks, what advice can you offer to small and medium businesses with limited cybersecurity skills on staff to protect themselves from software vulnerabilities? Anyone want to take that?
I'll jump in and say, minimize. I think that, in my opinion, for smaller organizations that don't have the ability to have full staffs for cybersecurity, I think that choosing platforms that minimize the amount of components, minimize the, I just to use a specific example, Chromebooks, right, is a platform that minimizes the amount of administration you need to do on them, or using cloud services, SaaS services, where a lot of those things are taken care of you. So if you minimize your responsibility and the things you need to do, then you have a better chance at being successful.
I would also advocate, just to add to Chris's statement, if it's possible to do so, find an MSSP you can work with. find a managed service provider who can provide those cybersecurity services either contractually for long term or at points in time to do assessments so that you can help build a roadmap. And when I think small and medium-sized businesses, I'm also thinking that there's a budgetary constraint. So just highly tactical advice would be almost every vertical, every critical infrastructure has an ISAC. So lean into the ISACs if you represent, an organization that's part of one of the ISACs. And then every state, I believe almost every state has a center of excellence for cybersecurity at this point as well. So lean into the state resources that are usually providing very, very low cost or free assessment products, engagement products, and just advice. So the staff that is there can at least have that level of support.
I'd like to build on what Sue said. At CISA, we offer a lot of free services for what we call sort of cyber poor organizations or resource, constrained organizations. The majority of our services are built for the federal government, but in many cases, we get permission from Congress to make them available to American companies or state and local governments or tribal or territorial governments, anyone who's got a role in supporting critical infrastructure. One of our most widely adapted and highly praised services, our cyber hygiene service, which offers free network vulnerability scanning to your internet-facing software, and we give a report which many of our constituents find very valuable. We see week after week that subscribers of that service continue to drive down their patching numbers and remove risky ports and services from the internet. And so we see a marked improvement in folks who sign up for that service. And if you can sustain a certain level of performance, then that gives you extra credit to bump up to get some of our other less scalable, but also free and very valuable assessment services. So I would recommend that you head out to the CISA website. You can find a lot of documents that can help you with managing a program, managing risk, setting up a program. But in addition, we have a lot of fantastic services that are totally free. And as a result of that, you are also doing your public duty, because your data helps us understand what is going on in the critical infrastructure sector you are a part of, so we can help work with that ISAC, that information sharing and analysis organization or center, to push for additional services or try and tackle the problem in a new way. But I would say head to the US CERT website, sign up for our alerts and services, and then also look for some local resources from your state or from your information sharing analysis center.
It's a win-win. You got to do it. It's good for you, good for the community.
It really is. Thank you.
So Funness asks, does calculating and using overall quantitative risk play a big role in vulnerability management? Does anyone want to take that one on?
Can I jump in?
Please.
Fair, our panelist who's a fair user.
We are a fair organization. And it does, because it helps us with prioritization. So FAIR's used in a couple different ways. So quantitative risk analysis generally. I won't use the branded version, but the quantitative risk analysis is something that we use for two things. One is if and when, as a security organization, we are thinking of buying something, buying a control or a service or a technology, we run this risk analysis to determine the likelihood, based on the likelihood and the impact of something going bump in the night. And this control that would have hopefully prevented, right? That's why we're buying it, or detects it. What's that cost balance look like? And if it looks like, hey, we're actually going to get a little bit of an ROI, then it becomes a much easier discussion when we're talking about budget issues. Now, when we're talking about vulnerability management specifically, there's going to be a lot of vulnerabilities that have to get addressed in any given register or roster. Any risk register that any company that's represented in this call, put together your list of vulnerabilities, you're going to have more than, I think, one. But oftentimes with limited resources, you have to prioritize. So what does that prioritization look like? And how do you justify that prioritization? And really, you can do that with a quantitative risk analysis. And it's taking into account, what's the impact? So you do have to understand, how do your products, your widgets work? You have to have an inventory. So you do need to know what's out there. So you have a lot of fundamental components you still have to know and have some level of maturity around to be able to do a pretty decent QRA. But once you have that, it becomes very simple when you're looking at what kind of investment, how much time, how much money, what kind of resources I have to put in, either it's a security organization, or what resources do I have to ask the business to put in to help with testing a product, rewriting a product, potentially if it's something that we have internally, or even working with a third-party vendor to get that resolution if it's not just a patch. So it's hard to do in the beginning, but once you operationalize it, it makes those discussion points about business cases so much easier. It becomes a 10-minute conversation versus a week-long marathon of negotiations.
Anyone else want to jump in there, or do we think that's well covered?
I agree.
I think it's well covered. So I wanted to, we've got about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to throw in one final question at you all and get your input on it looking forward. And I'll say there are a number of other great questions in the Q&A. So if speakers are staying on after this and are able to, they can answer some of those directly, because some of them are to specific panelists. But so as we look forward, what I think I've heard from the group is that many of the capabilities that we need to be able to continuing leveling up, getting better at this, we already have, and it's more of an implementation challenge. As we think this through, are there new things that we need that we'd like to draw out, things that we should go away and consider building upon, or is it really the case that better discipline, better implementation, overcoming some of those internal business challenges is really the keys to the kingdom? Anyone want to go first?
I'll jump in. I think that there were things discussed during both the earlier panel and this one where a lot of it is about automation and providing the right data that organizations need to both figure out the exploitability in the context of vulnerabilities. One of the things that I look at is vulnerability as just a form of quality. And there are multiple, aspects to quality within software. There's also the maintainability of the software. Well, actually, a lot of things in ITY, maintainability, agility, security, and so forth. In that, I look at there are some industry efforts around creating what is, I guess, a way to say it is like a nutrition label for software. So what is in the software that you're consuming. And I'd like to see. I know that there's already efforts underway. I'm just looking forward to as those things mature, so that we can consume those things in automated ways.
Super. I was trying to combobulate a dieting analogy here to jump in here, because I feel like I we can't get out of this panel without talking about SBOM and software bill of materials, which I think is what Chris is partly alluding to. That critical ingredients list, it's part of understanding what you have on your network. It might not solve the legacy problems that Sue talked about, but it's our way, I think it's our way of positioning ourselves so we don't have those problems going forward. I'm proud to say that CISA has recently hired the inimitable Dr. Alan Friedman to CISA, who is a big, who is one of the formulators of SBOM. So we're hoping to really ignite our work to further the adoption of this, as we telegraphed, or as the White House telegraphed in the executive order earlier this year. But back to your question, Alex, I think of this line of work as a challenge of losing weight. We've always known what needs to happen to lose weight. You need to eat less and to be extra and put out more calories. And yet as a country, we're not ever trending in the right direction on that. We're trending in the wrong direction. It doesn't mean that the science isn't there, but there are ways that science can keep coming in to help nudge us towards better decision making. That's really what wakes me up in the morning, is finding the way to nudge us into better behavior change in the vulnerability management space, and helping arm the folks who have to make decisions with better tools, better information, better decision-making frameworks, so that they can do something that's going to end up paying off in the long term, and not at the exclusion of what they have to do today.
I just want to inject a couple of statements just to go along with what Boyden and Chris were talking about, in that there's a lot that I think we're considering from a vulnerability management perspective that is just hygiene, right? And Boyden, that was a lot of what you were going after, is there's just a lot that's just hygiene. We get up in the morning, we brush our teeth. We get up, so we get up in the morning, we look at, hey, there's a new alert from such and such organization. Let's go ahead and patch and take care of these vulnerabilities. But I think the software bill of materials is where those of us who have products, right, and manage products, that becomes our new hygiene, our new morning routine, because it is a level of responsibility we owe to those who are using our products, the consumers, the patients, the members, from a healthcare perspective, and that becomes sort of your civic duty in many ways too. So we're gonna pull together a couple of different concepts right now. The one thing I also wanted to make sure we're being really cognizant of is the fact, and just to really put it on the nose, is when we talk about vulnerability management, let's not just think about patching, right? It is when we introduce vulnerabilities in our products, or when we have to deal with mitigating and remediating those vulnerabilities that are introduced into our environment. That is a two-way conversation that always has to happen. And there are quite a few other discussions, webinars, et cetera, where they're focused so much on, patch, because you got a product coming up. But it's not taking into consideration our responsibility to say, okay, what are we actually pushing out into the environment, even if we're not the developers, right? We're not the development team, but there is a process whereby we're pushing the product out, and there's an interaction with someone on the other end, and we owe it to them to make sure the product is of a quality where we're not necessarily putting their information at risk anymore. And if there's anything else from a vulnerability governance, vulnerability management perspective that I'd like to see us move forward with more automation, is the engagement with the other critical infrastructures, with IoT, IOMT, which is med devices. A lot that's happening within autonomous vehicles and autonomous transportation, and things that are like black box appliances, where we don't get the same level of transparency yet, because there's no mandate yet to have that same level of transparency. There's an expectation, but what else can we bring in from making sure that we have that covered from a standards perspective?
Wonderful. Well, I just want to close with a big thank you to our three panelists, to Sue, Boyden, and Christopher, for a great discussion. Hopefully they'll be able to stick around and perhaps answer some of the questions we didn't get to, but if not, we can certainly do some follow-up with you all. With that, I will turn things back over to my colleague, Mr. John Banghart.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Christopher, Sue, and Boyden. Great panel. Thanks again to the audience for their great questions and comments. We really appreciate that. So now it is my honor to introduce Director Eric Goldstein, who serves as the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity for DHS's CISA, which we've heard a lot about from Boyden, and many of you may be very familiar with. In this role, he leads CISA's mission to protect and strengthen federal civilian agencies and the nation's critical infrastructure against cyber threats. Previously, Goldstein was the head of cybersecurity policy, strategy, and regulation at Goldman Sachs, where he led a global team to improve and mature the firm's cybersecurity risk management program. He served at CISA's precursor agency, the National Protection and Programs Directorate, from 2013 to 2017, where I had the great privilege of being able to work with him in various roles, including policy advisor for federal network resilience, branch chief for cybersecurity partnerships and engagement, senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity, and senior counselor to the Undersecretary. At other points in his career, Goldstein practiced cybersecurity law at an international law firm, led cybersecurity research and analysis projects at a federally funded research and development center, and served as a fellow in advanced cyber studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, among other roles. So Eric, thank you so much for joining us. We're very, very happy to have you here. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, John. And really thanks for the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law for having this event. First of all, it's great to see so many friends and colleagues here together. It really is such a pleasure, and so important that we're all having this conversation. And so really my thanks for convening us all here to focus on these important issues. You know, I know that throughout the day, you've had a variety of panelists, of keynote speakers, including some from CISA and elsewhere in government, who have been talking about different aspects of the cybersecurity challenge, of the threats we're facing. And I'm not going to reiterate that, right? Because you all work in this every day. I'm not going to reiterate the cybersecurity threats that are attacking all of our networks or the vulnerabilities that we're seeing. I'm going to really focus on what do we do about it? How do we design a cybersecurity environment? How do we design collaboration models so that when we look back 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we can say, you know, national cybersecurity risk is actually less than it was in 2021. I think that's the vision that we're all seeking together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we in CISA want to be part of that positive trajectory in national risk. So we can actually see a downward slope in the risk we're facing and not face the same prevalence of extraordinarily pervasive, impactful intrusions like we've seen, frankly, over the past year. And I think vulnerability management plays a critical role in that, because at CISA, and I think as part of the broader cybersecurity ecosystem, our goal is to make the terrain harder for our adversaries, to make it more difficult for our adversaries to find ways to break into networks and cause harm. Because of course we know that our adversaries in many cases are rational actors that are making cost benefit to determine whether to attack a particular target or even whether to use a cyber mechanism in the first instance to achieve their goals. And so the more that we can do as a cybersecurity community to harden the targets that our adversaries are targeting and make it more expensive, more complicated, introduce more friction for what they're trying to do, we are likely to see a downward trend in the number of damaging intrusions that we're encountering. And I think there's a few different ways we can do this, but I'm going to really speak to two. The first are the specific efforts that CISA is working in as part of the broader cybersecurity ecosystem to reduce the prevalence of vulnerabilities in the most widely used and critical technologies. And then also going forward more broadly, how CISA is trying to lead as a partnership model, new collaboration structures, particularly our joint cyber defense collaborative, to ensure that we are all operating as one nation, public and private, against these threats. You know, in the first instance, it's worth harkening back, and I'm confident that some prior presenters did as well, to President Biden's cyber EO 14028. because this executive order, as John and many others on the call are well aware, really does go much deeper than other executive direction in addressing just the issues that we're talking about today. And it really does it on three fronts. The first is driving organizations in the federal government in the first instance, but ideally more broadly, to really understand what is the software that an organization uses for trust relationships, for elevated privileges, for those functions that if an adversary gained unauthorized access could really gain pervasive access and cause significant harm? And then how do we drive heightened testing, heightened controls, heightened assurance around those specific pieces of software or technology assets in order to make sure that we are prioritizing our universally limited security budgets to drive down vulnerabilities for those technologies that we know will cause the most harm if compromised. The second, and I know the prior panelist spoke a bit about this, is how do we drive more ubiquitous utilization of software bill of materials, or SBOM, which is critically important because there is, I think, no other aspect of technology where we are so confident in not understanding the lineage of the technology that we are putting in our systems in a way that, frankly, we've become accustomed to with software and hardware in many cases. And so the more that we can coalesce around a community to adopt common taxonomies, common approaches to software bill of materials, and use that to really make sure that we understand what we are using on our systems, what software we're running, what hardware we're running, the component parts therein, and how vulnerabilities in those component parts could introduce vulnerabilities or risks, the more secure we'll be. CISA is extremely proud to be leading a key portion of that effort, but this is a true partnership where we all need to be working together, whether we are on the standard setting side, the vulnerability disclosure side, the end user side, or the manufacturer or OEM or developer side, where we need to be actually adopting software bill of materials in the first instance so that customers and other stakeholders understand the potential for vulnerabilities in a given device's lineage. The third piece is understanding the implications of our long tail supply chains. And so, before joining CISA, as John noted, I worked at a large financial firm, and it was an extraordinarily complicated problem to understand the web of vendors and their vendors and their vendors that could introduce a potential supply chain risk. And we saw this manifested recently, of course, in the Kaseya intrusion, where we saw a ransomware actor compromise a victim who then compromised a series of MSPs who then compromised, in some cases, their end user customers. And that's the kind of threat that we need to be attuned to, but also implies that we need to focus on not just vulnerabilities in the first instance in our organizations, but also draw that through line across the supply chain so that we understand the implications of vulnerabilities in critical suppliers and their critical suppliers, and how those webs of trust relationships can cause cascading impacts if they're compromised. So we are delighted to be working with our partners across government, including in the Office of Management and Budget, to really improve the way that the federal government is using contract clauses in the first instance, which sounds so boring and quotidian, but we know is one of the strongest tools to drive change. And we look forward to working with our partners across sectors to make sure, A, that we get this right for the federal government, but also that we're doing work that is ideally extensible more broadly to other sectors and partners. I want to broaden it for a moment, which is to talk about how do we collaborate to manage cybersecurity risks more generally. And too often, our framing has been that our goal in collaboration is to share information. The government will share some information and we'll expect something in return, or vice versa. And frankly, the dynamic has been transactional. And that can't be sustainable for us to achieve the goals we're seeking, which is why CISA recently stood up the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. This is a really exciting new construct because the key here is this is not some new body that CISA is convening and we're asking folks to come to the table. This is envisioned as being a truly multi-stakeholder forum for real operational collaboration, where we have partners in government and the private sector and internationally come together as equals, bringing their respective resources, authorities, capabilities, all to bear around shared hard problems. and then planning around exercising and executing plans to reduce identified specific risks over time. And so our metric here is not going to be the volume of information shared, the number of companies at the table, how many meetings we hold, how many alerts we issue. Our goal is to work together to say, how can we evaluate specific risks and actually show that we, as a cybersecurity community, as a collective, if you will, are driving these risks down over time? Because that's really the end state we're seeking. And so, our goal is to catalyze efforts across government and the private sector to move away from measuring these proxy variables and really help to bring together the hard work of moving towards collective risk reduction. And I just want to restate here that our goal is for this not to be a CISA-led effort, but our goal is for this to really be a community where organizations join and participate and contribute because they see shared collective benefit. And part of this also is the idea that every organization in this country is at risk. That concept will not be novel to anybody in this discussion. And so even if an organization has not been victimized today, the more that they can collaborate, share information, report incidents, and join the kind of planning efforts that we're standing up through the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the more secure we'll all be as a result. And so really, my request from the organizations that are on this call is consider not just collaborating, but deepening your collaboration. And not just with CISA, but with all of our partners who are all in this together. We think that the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC, is a really effective, innovative structure in which for this collaboration to occur, but it's not the only one. And so, really the only way that we will make progress towards reducing the slope of cybersecurity risk, the only way that we'll make progress towards looking back in a decade and saying, that work we did in the 2020s really did add value to getting us out of this era of ubiquitous insecurity, is about coming together, government and the private sector, and driving some real material change. And so would encourage anybody interested in collaborating more deeply, whether in the JCDC or more broadly as part of our national cybersecurity community, please do reach out. Would love to have a conversation with certainly anybody in this discussion. And it's conversations like this that really will help us make sure that we have the right organizations, the right people at the right tables to drive down the kind of significant risks that we know that we're facing every day. So with that, my thanks again. My thanks to John and the center team. It is always such a pleasure. I'm looking forward to continuing our collaboration to come.
Eric, thank you so much. As always, a pleasure to see you. Thank you for all your hard work and everybody else there at CISA. And while we don't have time for questions today, I want to point out that there's a number of comments coming across about just how significant that collaboration with CISA is. And how much folks really do appreciate it. So, obviously that's a huge part of what you do, and you folks are doing it very, very well. So as we wrap up, I'll just remind folks that part of what we are doing today and the conversation that we had today was a starting point for a conversation that we think is going to be ongoing. We really need to have other folks participating, being part of the work that we're trying to accomplish, about the topics we touched on today, about topics we couldn't get to. Those are all things that are important when it comes to this topic. So I put it in the chat, but also here, please reach out to us if you have any interest, any thoughts, ideas. If you think your organization would like to be a part of what we're doing, we would love to talk to you and think about how we can all work together. So please reach out to us here. And with that, I'm going to wrap us up. Thanks again. Virtual applause from everyone for our amazing panelists today. I think this was truly a great event. Really appreciate folks taking time out of your day today to be a part of it. So thank you for that. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great week. And we will see you on a future center webinar. Thank you very much.